Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. We have somebody very special today, somebody who is a soil scientist who has studied a lot about the soil food web and what happens in our natural processes. Dr. Elaine Ingham. How are you?
Doing okay. Yeah. Recovering from attack of the pollen, but finally starting to reverse that effect. Whee!
So you went to Brazil and you were working on some project down there. Do you speak Brazilian or Portuguese? But did you do okay?
Because I brought a colleague that speaks both Portuguese as well as English. And so we did the Elaine says the sentence because most of the audience could actually speak English. And then the person that came with me, Dr. Carla Portugal, she did the translation into Portuguese. So everyone could understand.
Portuguese.
Kind of Portuguese. And that's fun because then I get to kind of watch the audience and see what the reactions are as we start talking about this, that you don't need inorganic fertilizers. You don't need pesticides. You don't need herbicides. You don't need any of those toxic chemicals. And you're still going to be able to grow a bumper crop, typically at least 10 to 20% increase in yields when you're using the proper sets of microorganisms for the plants. You can reduce the amount and time, the effort that you have to put into maintaining your crop, and we reduce water use by 50 to 70%. And so in this crazy climate change world that we're getting into, you can store all of that water in your soil if you have the proper organisms making the structure in your soil.
Interesting. So when you talk about microbiology and life in your soil, now do you need to aerate to get that life, or does that life aerate it for you?
The life will, if you put it in on the top of the soil surface, the organisms will move through building structure. As they go, they hit a really hard compacted place. It's going to take them a little bit longer to rebuild that structure to allow the oxygen and the water and the roots of your plants to infiltrate and move down and through. But usually, if we've got a foot or two of compacted soil, it takes somewhere around 4 to 6 weeks for the microorganisms to move down and reform structure and start holding water. Wow. And of course, they're not going to stop there. As long as you've got organic matter in your soil, these organisms are going to continue moving downwards, building that structure. So as deep as possible, you've got water stored in that profile. And when the plant above ground starts getting thirsty for a drink and it's not getting enough water from downstairs, then though the plant will say, you've got to grow deeper further, access that water that's already been stored. And, in places where we're getting snow melt off the mountains and it's coming down to the valleys, that's lots of nutrients in that water being carried, as well as the water itself needs to be stored in your soil. And then you don't have to irrigate. You don't have to be out there paying for the water. That at this point, we've managed to almost suck dry all of the aquifers. And so what you're getting from that aquifer is not good to drink. We had rented a building that we were going to start doing composting there because there was so much demand for good compost. So we started making that compost, and it was great stuff, March, April, May, and all of a sudden in June, things started getting a little strange. The quality here is not as good as it used to be. What are you doing wrong? We're not doing anything wrong. It's just like we were always doing. July came, and we couldn't sell that compost because it just did not have the biology in it. Well, what's happening? So we had to go through everything, and we finally said, I think we better take another determination of what's in the water. back in January, February, March, there was no problem with the water because the aquifer was at least half full. But as all of the grass industry, we grow 60% of the world's grass seed here in the Willamette Valley, and as all of that gets used up, now you're talking about the dregs. Here we are getting the bottom of the glop, and I think it was manganese was so high, it was toxic to everything. And we needed to change the drinking fountain to something where we brought clean, clear water in and drank it because it was causing bad effects to our employees. The person who owned the building, they never told us about this. I think they were clueless. They just didn't know that they were causing this kind of problem. So, as soon as our lease ran out, we said bye, because we want good, clean water to drink. And just like our microorganisms need good, clean water to drink. So getting that biology right, putting that back out on the soil, you would be able to store enough water for 2 to 3 years in the soil going down about 8-10 feet. We had enough water stored that we didn't have to be irrigating, didn't have to be watering using that really bad drinking water in the city of Corvallis.
So that's an important fact too, is that grass is dumb. It's not something, it's a conspicuous consumption thing that goes back to the 1600s and these lush lawns and stuff. But this is a thirsty, aggressive, nutrient hungry thing. And to grow it and to have it be a status symbol, it's killing us.
I know. Why do we think that one species of plant over all of this area is somehow beautiful? Where does that go back to? What we want to pretend we're the king of England?
Yeah. To some extent, I think. Yeah, I think there's egotism runs all through humanity. We cannot seem to get rid of it. So, but you've had like a long career in dealing with this. I'm somebody who's just started my kind of gardening journey, but still you have had a Ph.D. You studied at Colorado State. You studied at Oregon State. And this subject doesn't get a lot of attention, but what led you to be interested in things like soil, agriculture, and the environment?
I think it was really my father who instilled that in me. He was a veterinarian at the University of Minnesota. He was head of the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology and Veterinary Medicine. And he used to take me out on farm with him when he was going to go investigate why is half of the herd of dairy cows down on the ground. Some are dying, some are, what's gone wrong? And the farmer always wanted to blame the company that made the food for the animals. Well, my father would always send me out into the pastures that the animals were feeding from. And my dad would say, well, I want you to look for these 4 different kinds of plants, looking at the leaf structure, the twig structure, how many leaves per, all of those good identifying things, because these were all poisonous plants. Well, what's left in that farmer's field after he grazes? If he overgrazes, these poison plants are going to increase in density. And so now when you send your animals out into that pasture, they don't have anything to eat but the poison plants. So they come down with all these symptoms of, their food is poisoning them, because it is. But it's not what's coming out of the bag of dried cow chow. Yeah. It's the fact that they're eating out in the pastures where they've overgrazed too much. So that was my initial introduction to why soil was important and why you don't want to allow these certain kinds of conditions to occur. But we didn't really have an answer for why, other than you're overgrazing this field. what all is exactly going on, because you'd think, well, there's all that manure going out there. Isn't that making the soil more nutritious? Isn't that allowing more of these plants? No, not if the soil's completely compacted. Not if the only thing you've got are those those materials, those minerals, NPK in the manure. You have to turn the manure back into soil before the plants can use it. So I had lots of these kinds of questions that my dad couldn't respond to, because the standard soil scientist approach is it's just there, and if it's not just there, you got to put on bags and bags and bags, tons and tons and tons of different kinds of nutrients in order for those plants to grow. Well, it's not true. Mother Nature has a nutrient cycling system. If you look at a table where it shows the total concentration of all these different nutrients that should be in your soil, they're massive. Those nutrient values, I don't care what soil you want to talk about, but you've got more than enough nutrients to raise a crop of plants for several thousand years if you wanted to, given the way Mother Nature cycles nutrients. So you've got all those nutrients in. Those nutrients will be replenished every growing season, the seasonal movement of water through your land. So you do not want to dam up that flow of water subsurface going through your soil, because that's bringing a lot of those nutrients from upstream. So then how do you get those nutrients that are in a plant unavailable fashion back into a plant available form that they can take up? So what's the story? You can't do this without the microorganisms. The plant will put out exudates, which basically is sunlight energy. So as long as the plant has enough green leaves, it's going to be taking that chlorophyll and making energy bound in the carbon-carbon bond. That's sunlight energy holding those two carbons together. So the plant will put out the exudates to tell the bacteria and the fungi in the soil what nutrients it's lacking.
Wow.
And then the bacteria and fungi go, okay, gotcha, boss. I'm going to make the enzymes to pull the nutrient that the plant required, and they'll pull those nutrients right out of the nutrient layers in the sand, silt, and clay compounds. Well, look at rocks, look at pebbles, all boulders, parent material. It's all the same thing. That's your sand, silt, and clay. And as the bacteria and fungi chew on it, then those individual sand, silt, and clay granules are released into the soil solution. Well, and then the bacteria and fungi have the enzymes where they pull those nutrients out of that crystalline bilayer of those the sand, silt, and clays, and now you've got organic nitrogen, organic fertilizers, organic nutrients tied up in those bacteria and fungi. And then that's still not available to your plant. So what you have to have are the protozoa, the nematodes, microarthropods, earthworms, things like that, who eat bacteria and fungi. And when any one of those predator organisms chews on the bacteria and fungi, there's too high a concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, iron, zinc, all of those things in the bacteria and fungi, which would actually kill their predators if the predators didn't release those nutrients back into the soil solution. So you see where the term the poop loop comes from? This is it. When the bacteria and fungi get eaten by their predators, it releases those excess nutrients in the bacteria and fungi. And now the plant says, thank you. That was very kind. That's what I needed.
So when you say fungi, you're talking about the mycorrhizal networks and other networks like that?
They're part of the picture. But they are the mycorrhizal fungi tend to have just one or two of the nutrients that the plant specifically gets short in. So nitrogen and phosphorus is very typically. They'll pull in other nutrients too, but not like the rest of the aerobic, beneficial fungi and bacteria. They are probably the most important in getting all of the mix of nutrients back into the plant in the proper balances. Because, of course, the plant's not going to put out a exudate that says, I need more zinc, if the plant doesn't need zinc. So it's, that's out of the diet right now. I've got more than enough. But let's say that plant doesn't have enough iodine. Then it'll put out the message that says, I need more iodine. Come on, bring it on board, guys.
Wow.
And so pretty soon, there's the nutrient that the plant requires in order to be healthy and happy.
So on the industrialized agriculture scale, do they even pay attention to things like fungal networks and nematodes and things like this? Or do they, and do you work with them, and do you get frustrated with people like that?
I do get very frustrated with them because they have no concept that they need these things. And I do like to ask questions like, okay, so you tell me that you can't grow enough food to feed the world because there's not enough nutrient in the soil. You've got to add more inorganic nitrogen, the most popular one. And I go, wait a minute. So you're telling me that, okay, the crop that you harvest is taken off of the field, and that's all those nutrients going to market. And so you are draining the concentration of those nutrients in your land. So you're going to have to put on inorganic fertilizers. So then explain to me, why is it that in a forest of old growth sequoia or redwoods, or you name it, whatever tree you want to talk about in an old growth, they've been around for, the redwoods, they've been around for 2,000 years. Each individual plant, 2,000 years old. And here we are in a concentration of those trees. So per acre, way more nutrients are being removed from that soil and stored in the trunk of each and every tree. So how can those redwoods have any nutrients left to grow on next year? Where does it all come from? Well, that's because we've got this total nutrient. Until you run out of rocks and pebbles and boulders and parent material, you shouldn't have to worry about nutrients. There's more than enough to grow your plants. And just in case that wasn't enough, all of the water coming through that system in the springtime usually, it's carrying those extra nutrients that get pulled out of solution and into the silica bilayer and the sand, silt, clays, rocks, pebbles, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as we let all these normal, natural nutrient cycling processes occur, we shouldn't have any limitation on the growth of plants. So think back 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. We were growing plants back then, and many of those soils are still growing plants. As long as you take care of the biology, they'll take care of your plant. So stop working so hard. Stop having to put all of those tons of nutrients into your tractor and drive across the field up and down. And there's salary time. There's diesel you got to pay for. You got to pay for wear and tear on the tires and all the gizmos and engines and things like that. This is insanity. Yeah. Expecting that you're going to be able to put out a good product.
Yeah.
Once you've destroyed that biology in the soil, there's no way to get the nutrients that are in your soils. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we take phosphorus that we mine from some place in the, in the U.S. where all these different, and you put on the phosphate fertilizers, or you put on calcium. And when you want to think about what's the effect of these inorganic fertilizers going on the soil, when you apply nitrate fertilizer. Nitrate is a salt. And that means they're going to take up water. The positively charged part of your inorganic fertilizer is going to bind with the negatively charged hydroxide portion of water, and the negative charge of the nitrate fertilizer charges with the positive, the hydrogen. And now that water is no longer available to your plant. So that means the more inorganic fertilizers you put on, think about calcium carbonate. How many tons of calcium carbonate were you told to put on your field last year? 3 tons? Think of how much water that's taking away from your plant. And it's just like, how do we not pay attention to Mother Nature at all?
And 1,000 years ago, that was a battle technique, was to go with the Romans, is to go salt the earth so nothing would grow. They're shooting themselves in the foot. And here is Dr. Elaine trying to stop them from shooting themselves in the foot. And they're just, it's an uphill battle, I guess.
Yep. But this is how my dad farmed. Yeah, but it's not how your grandfather farmed. So why didn't that information get through each of the generations? When they sit down and look, we have hundreds, thousands. We've got literally thousands of people. I think we've worked with something close to 10 million acres. I don't have the exact number, but it's up there. Because you go back on our website and you start looking at all of the case studies that we've got, where here are people who are coming off of the inorganic fertilizers and they're actually getting greater yields than they did with the inorganic fertilizer.
Yeah.
Because you have to have the organisms to access what's in the soil. Yeah. Without that whole food web, you're up a creek. Well, and then you can't hold water in the soil if you've entirely destroyed those sets of microorganisms. So not only do we have a lack of nutrients, but we've got a lack of water. There are about 8 overarching principles we talk about. And, getting through them all is fun.
Yeah, I wanted to tell everybody out there that she runs the Soil Food Web School. And she's offering massive amounts of education that people should know if they're even interested. Check her out. Check out that website. I'm going to leave all the links and everything in the description. And so, but if there's an emergency and you absolutely need to get nutrients to your plants or to your soil, you can make compost tea.
Right.
Where did this idea come from, and what do you think are some good ingredients to have in a nice cup of compost tea?
Well, it's a lot easier to put out water, something dissolved in water instead of the solid. So when we make compost, we're getting all the complete biology that your plant requires. And there is you have to understand the successional system and where different crop plants belong in that successional system. So if you're trying to grow kelp, or you're trying to grow kale, cole crops, broccoli, those kinds of plants, they definitely need more bacteria, a lot more, about 2 to 3 times more bacteria are required than fungi under those conditions to make sure the type of nutrient being made and the plant can take up what it needs then. And that's going to be made for that plant. We select for the plant that grows under these conditions. Well, with time, all that great cellulose inside those plants, especially if you just leave the residue from that plant sitting on the surface of the soil, the decomposition will occur, and you'll now start being able to grow corn, tomatoes, slightly later in the successional process. So there's most of our vegetable and row crops are grown where we're almost equal 1-to-1 ratio of fungi to bacteria, and there's some minimal levels in there that you have to find out about. So is that going to be good enough to grow that crop? Well, what if you really want to grow berries? Well, now you have to get even more fungi in that soil. It's got to be more fungal than it is bacterial. You've got to have the right kinds of predators. And so go into orchard systems that have to have even more fungal dominance. So you have to understand that process as well. Succession is what we talk about. And one of the best books, probably, or the easiest book for most people to understand, is the USDA's Soil Biology Primer. And I basically wrote the first, I think it's 6 or 7 chapters out of the total of, 8 or 9, can't remember. So I had some, other people wrote the sections on microarthropods and on so I've even forgotten what that.
That's okay.
I always like to bring my age up at this point. I'm 70 years old. You can forgive me for forgetting a few things, I hope.
When you're 70 years old, you get a little path and you bring it out anytime you're in any trouble. You say, look, I'm old. Leave me alone.
It's like, come back in another 2 hours and I will have remembered. The search and locate functions just sometimes don't want to work.
I'm already at the age where I have to take a nap after I eat lunch.
So, and it's better to take care of your body that way,
Yeah. So these fungal networks are the most amazing unknown part of this system, I think. And what happens to them in the wintertime?
If they're far enough down in the soil, if it doesn't freeze down here, and most soils don't freeze when you get, 3 feet, 4, 10, 15, it depends on exactly where you are. It doesn't freeze. The fungi just keep growing. They may slow down a little bit because production, has some relationship to weather, but they're not going to stop growing. Mm-hmm. It's like in the old growth forests in the state of Washington up on the peninsula. If you go to the cedar forest and you gently brush that organic material, the snow and the organic matter early in that springtime period, and you try to put your fingers into that soil, you go, I can see that it's all soil, but it's all held together by this massive fungal hyphae, just all of it, all over. And some of the people who have gone out and looked at this, they'll measure what's the diameter of that particular one single individual in that forest system. And it's something like 100 miles wide. And it goes down 25, 30 feet. It is the largest organism on this planet.
Wow.
And people just don't know that these things exist. So you go time and it's just this mat of fungal hyphae. You finally tear some up and there's just masses of fungal hyphae that you ripped apart from the rest of the system. And that seems like, wow, all the carbon is in that system is in that fungal mat. It's just amazing.
Wow.
But in the springtime, the predators.
I lost you.
There?
Yeah, gotcha.
Is that back?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the springtime, the predators of the fungi wake up, and here come the flying squirrels, and their absolute favorite food are the truffles on the actomycorrhizal fungi that grow on the conifers. And so they're busy in the soil, all churning and turning the soil, and they're going to find every last. And so by the time you get there in mid-June, July, you brush aside the organic matter layer and you go, there's not a lot of fungi in here. I mean, there's a goodly amount, but there's not like, Elaine's crazy. She doesn't know what she's talking about. That's because most of it got eaten by the predators in the system. So not only the microarthropods, but the macroarthropods, the spiders, and all of the earthworms and incotraeans, and now we add a level of squirrels and such, where it's there's not nearly as much fungal hyphae left. Okay, and they just keep eating on that poor fungal. I feel bad for that fungal mat because it put so much work in over the wintertime, and now here it is practically destroyed. But then winter's going to come. And so the flying squirrels all go back up into their little beds and, shut down for the wintertime. And here come the fungi. And within just a couple weeks, you'll start seeing that mat starting to reform. You may even have snow on the ground. And yet, because of the protection of that organic matter layer, the temperature in the soil never freezes.
Wow.
And so all winter long, decomposing all those needles, decomposing all those residues. And now we're back to the mat has taken over.
So are you familiar with fairy rings?
Oh, yeah. And that's typically because one particular kind of fungus has one. And it happens to be that it happens to be the fungus that puts up those they're usually white. They may be kind of triangular, or they may be rounded tops. So a couple of different species will do this particular job. And they started out originally from a single inoculum in the center of the fairy ring. So you get a couple mushrooms that year. Something eats them, And then the next year, the ring moves out a little bit. And so the next set of mushrooms are, okay, you're starting your fairy ring. They get eaten. And then the next year, it's a little further out. The next year, it's a little further out. So it's the fungus. I used up all the good food in here. That's somebody else's problem now, but I'm going to keep working on that good stuff. If you don't want that fairy ring, and I kind of think fairy rings are cute. So, but if you don't want it in your lawn, and doesn't our upbringing say, oh, can't have any fairy rings, that's ugly. No, it's not. To get rid of it, what you do is put in some compost that's got lots of different kinds of fungi in it, especially some of the mycorrhizal fungi. Spread that over the fairy ring, and the competition prevents that fungus from having all of the energy it needs to produce the ring of mushrooms. You might get one or two, but it won't be a ring anymore. So I'm kind of famous amongst my neighbors at being able to solve all of their fairy ring problems. And it's like magic.
Problems. They're beautiful.
So, it's mycorrhizal fungi are another mechanism for plants getting nutrients into the plant. The fungus will be putting out very specific sugars to wake up the specific mycorrhizal fungus that it needs. Cool. So there's a lot of, the plant is in control. The microorganisms in the soil to some extent are like the workers. They're the busy bees. They're the ones that are actually doing what the boss has told them they need to do. And so they'll go out, growing their hyphae out into the soil. And, when you start looking at some of these relationships, the root systems of these big trees can go down into the soil 150, 250, 350 feet into the ground. So think of the water that they're able to get to if you have a root system that's going that deep. Don't need to worry about water if you've got good soil all the way down. And the fungal hyphae are growing on those roots, moving laterally, sideways, exploring the soil in all directions, pulling nutrients in for the plant, translocating them. And it's a very rapid system. If the plant says, I need manganese, it's going to be supplied with that manganese in almost no time at all.
So without this symbiosis, are there fungal networks that don't work so well with plants and refuse to work with plants?
Yeah, the disease causers are things that will look at the plant as I'm going to attack and consume.
Oh, for instance, when your roots start composting, or when you get like a mycelium started, and what's the difference between the compost, the fuzz on my compost, and the fungal networks in the ground?
The fuzzy wuzzies on your compost surfaces are typically not so wonderful fungi, and you want to get that re-aerated. And the problem is aeration. The bad guys grow in reduced oxygen conditions. As soon as the conditions start getting aerobic, the disease-causing organisms really cannot compete anymore. And so you always want well-structured, good airflow. When you pick up a handful of that soil and kind of give it a shake, you should be able to see the hallways, the openings. Some of them will be pretty large, some of them will be smaller, some will be very small. But that's the structure I'm talking about when we're dealing with the microorganisms. The bacteria make the glues to take sand, silt, and clay and bind it together around their body so they're protected from predation. And so inside there, they're happily reproducing. So that micro aggregate's going to get a little larger, larger. It's kind of like condominium housing for bacteria is what they're producing. And then the fungi come along and they grow as long strands. They're like threads, the ribbons that we use to keep all our Christmas presents packaged together.
Cool.
And so they pull those micro aggregates in, and now we've got a macro aggregate. So when you pick up that handful of soil and shake it, you'll be able to see where some of the macro aggregates are, because they form the basis for the big pores in the soil that will hold water against the force of gravity. And so it's like a little lake for your roots to come across and find. And of course, it's water for all of the denizens closer. And so building that structure is extremely important in keeping air movement from up above ground down into the soil so nothing goes anaerobic. All of those fungi, all of those bacteria are working really hard not to destroy. But then we as human beings come along and we apply, glyphosate. And glyphosate, for all intents and purposes, let's call it what it is. It's a sterilant. It kills almost everything. And so why are you surprised that your plants are going to get diseased? Disease requires the reduced oxygen, because otherwise they've got to compete with aerobic organisms, and diseases don't have the ability to use foods in aerobic conditions. Now, you'll find a few exceptions, so yes, okay, there's, a couple thousand, they're facultative anaerobes is what they're called. They can function under oxygen conditions if there's no competition. But as soon as you get a good guy fungus, those facultative anaerobes are going to be restricted to the reduced oxygen conditions. So that's how you make certain in your compost pile that you're not growing any disease-causing organisms. You've got to keep it aerobic. You don't want any bad smells exiting from the pile. If you walk over to your pile and you go, and it's like, oh boy, that's not, let's get that pile turned as rapidly as possible. But then you need to start over.
Yeah.
You're going to have to.
And so aerobic, that's when you have plenty of air and that your bacteria or whatever that you're cultivating is healthy and doing well. Anaerobic is the opposite, right?
Right. Those are the bad guys.
Okay.
Those are those things that, for the greatest part, what you're looking at, the percentage of the organisms that you're looking at are going to be disease-causing organisms. So it's, so when you have, like landslides and things get buried, well, in the landslide coming down, all of the structure just got pounded out of that soil. It was soil, it's now dirt. And then it buries things. And so they can't get enough oxygen down there. And so they die. And you get to replant the new surface, and it's going to perhaps take you a little while. If you know what you're doing, you usually can get a really good crop growing in another year. So this year, take care of the soil, take care of the ground, get the biology back in there. Next year, you'll be able to plant, and you'll have the root systems growing that will keep that soil in place.
That's good. And one more question that's absolutely necessary. The mole. I've seen you give lots of speeches, and on all your diagrams, there's a little cartoon mole, and he's really cute. And I think, and I've seen some in my neighborhood, and they make the little holes, and they make little mounds, and they're just interesting creatures. What purpose do they have in this whole system?
They're Mother Nature's way of telling you. And so it's a message from Mother Nature saying your ground's compacted. And she's sending you this gift of the mole, the shrew, the vole, the gopher, whatever you want, whichever you've got for your part of the world. And their job is to build tunnels and bring oxygen into that soil so that the good guys can start growing and they can start building structure. Well, if you're wiping out your microorganisms every year, you're going to leave those little ground dwellers very, very happy because they will not have to move on. But if you stop killing the good guy bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, etc., then in the next year, as all of that aeration has happened, then the bacteria and fungi get to work building structure. And so now when that vole comes along, or that shrew or gopher, whatever, comes along and starts making its tunnel through fresh soil, the tunnel collapses behind him. Because all that well-structured soil can move. There is space for it to move, and it will drop. And the vole's going to go, yeah, I don't like living here. I can't make a living. I can't find my roots. It's time to pick up and go, Virginia. And out the door they go. They're going to move to another place that is compacted. So don't use bad words when you start encountering voles and shrews, and they're doing work for you. Now, if you want to get to that point where you get rid of all that compaction really rapidly, go and till the soil for the last time. But remember that with any tillage equipment, you can only go down so far. 6 inches, 10 inches, 18 inches, 24 inches is probably about as deep as I've seen. Well, we've got some stuff at 4 feet. You go in and you aerate that top layer of the soil. But because that tillage equipment weighs a lot, you're compacting the soil below that. This is being compacted. The voles and the shrews and the gophers are going to may start working down there instead of up here. Well, at least they'll stop eating the roots of your plants.
Yeah.
But you want to get all of that soil reconstructed. You want to get that structure built, and it is the microorganisms. So you've got the microorganisms. Well, maybe you need to come along with a compost extract. If you put a compost out, you're going to be inoculating up here on the surface. Maybe even if you mixed that compost in when you were tilling, that's good because now you've got the organisms in there already. But it takes a while for them to do their jobs. Mm-hmm. And so what we'll often do then is follow up with a compost extract where it's a liquid and it infiltrates along with all those organisms being carried in that water. It will hopefully infiltrate until it hits a compaction layer. Mm. And because water cannot move through soil that is compacted more than just a couple pounds per square inch, the water hangs up here. The microorganisms start doing their job right here. And within a couple of weeks, you're going to have dealt with the compaction as you keep going down. We want that compaction to be obliterated. We want the structure to be built all the way down to the maximum depth of the plant that you want to grow can put its root system. And so now you've made the habitat perfect for your plant to grow. And that means you're going to get all the nutrition you can possibly manage in that plant, in the food that we're eating. You didn't have to use any extra water. You didn't have to use any toxic chemicals. Think of how much money you're going to save. And think of how much money you'll save because you're not paying somebody's salary to drive a tractor that costs money, that eats diesel. So, the savings are phenomenal.
Yeah.
One of the people that we work with, Todd Harrington, has a company, Todd Harrington's Organics, for example, in Connecticut. Is it Massachusetts? Those of us from the West have a hard time with all the little teeny tiny states. Yeah. And I tease him all the time. But the work that he's been doing with large scale growers, both small scale and large scale, he's showing that in a couple 100 acres that his growers have saved over $1 million in the first growing season. Yeah, you got to have some acreage there to multiply. But even if you're dealing with something that's just one, 100 foot by 100 foot, you can still be saving $200 or $300. And you're growing your own food, and now you know exactly what's in that food. And you don't have to worry about whether that soil is healthy or not, because all these microorganisms that you put in first decompose those toxic chemicals. They're going to take those heavy metals and stick them into the structure of the organic matter, because these organisms don't want to die. Yeah. And they've got to get rid of it somehow, so they change the form of that particular compound. So now you've got remediated soil. Just make sure you let that happen for the year before you put in your crops.
I mean, there's things like arsenic and lead and all kinds of other horrible things that can get, and it's amazing to know that there are organisms that can help you remediate that. That's incredible. Yep. And you're going to have to come back and do a whole episode about worms, because I love worms. I think worms are so cool, and they've always been my friend in the garden.
Yeah, they're great creatures to, because the rear end of the earthworm is just like this magical place for these really good organisms to grow. They are they're multiplying those really top-notch organisms in their back part of their bodies. And each little cast that's pooped out is chock full of those really good organisms. So what might be going in the front end could be horrible, awful. It's going to kill your plants. What's coming out the other end? Going to grow some great plants.
The plants immediately just get all happy and start stretching for the sky. They go, worm castings, yay!
He finally gave us worm castings.
Yeah.
So whichever way you want to do it your way. Just make sure that you're getting the good guys back into that soil. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we, of course, have consultants all over the world. If you go to our website, you'll be able to see where they are all at. And so the closest one to you is probably what you want to contact, and start talking to that person about what you want to see happen in your soil.
And everybody out there, go to her website, check out the Soil Food Web School, soilfoodweb.com, I believe. You can Google it quite easily. Worth checking out. Absolutely cool. I want to thank Dr.
We got some great cartoons on there too, so enjoy those. They really help people understand some of the more complex things I've been talking about today.
It helped me because I'm not so smart. I could be smarter. I'm always working on it. So we're going to have Dr. Elaine back because she's awesome. We'll say goodbye to everybody now. Bye.
Ciao.